Hi guys, and welcome to the Zortex Anxiety Support channel, or welcome back. Today's video is going to be about thinking errors. It's something really common with mental health issues, especially anxiety disorders or depression, that basically we develop a certain way of thinking, and those tend to be negative habits, which is where our anxiety stems from, or depression. But they usually form a part of our subconscious, so we don't even know that we're doing it. And in this video, I thought I would address some of the thinking errors and ways to overcome it so that you can possibly identify it in yourself and then move forward. So let's get on into the video. The first one is a mental filter. We tend to create our understanding of situations, which is fine. But in certain times or situations, we develop a filter. So we will only look through that filter and interpret it to fit our understanding. Take, for example, you think people dislike you. You go out with some friends and they have a conversation between themselves, or they ask you to go to the bar, something like that. You can then interpret that and say, well, they don't want to talk to me, or they just want me around so that I can carry drinks. Things like that actually aren't necessarily true. They're our interpretation, but they fit that story that's in our head. It can happen with so many other things, but that's really quite a common thinking error. But it's also quite easy to overcome, because the moment you notice that you're making an assumption, you just retract and say, actually, I don't know why that's happened, and it might not be that at all. Or if you see it to fit your theory, see how maybe it doesn't fit your theory. Look for something else. So yes, it will take more effort to actually look for something that doesn't fit your theory, but that will slowly train your brain to overcome that thinking error. On a similar line, another thinking error is judgments. So when something happens, or we have a conversation with somebody, any events, people, places, we often tend to make judgments. And even more commonly, we don't notice that we're making those judgments. That can lead to a lot of anxiety, because you can interpret a situation totally wrong. And that's not our fault, that's just how we think. But if you notice that you're making a judgment, then you can actually, again, look for a contradiction. Take, for example, you've gone to the cinema, or you've gone to a festival of some kind. You can view that as everyone's crowding you. It's the worst event you've been to, everything's terrible, and people don't really want you there, you're trying really hard but people aren't accepting you, something like that, when actually you're not describing what's happening. So somebody might just have glanced at you and glanced away, but you may be interpreting that as they're looking at you because they don't want you to be there. Those kinds of little judgments, again, really commonly. And about people, often we judge people, and that can bring about a lot of anxiety in different ways, because you can be judging, saying that they're nasty or that they don't want you around, when actually we don't know what's going on. And that's really important, actually, because I had an issue recently where somebody made a judgment about me without even considering the possibilities that were going on in my life. And it's so easy to judge other people. So it's brilliant to take a step back and understand that we don't know everything that's going on in everybody's lives. Somebody may behave a certain way towards us, but we shouldn't necessarily take that personally. Again, honesty is the best policy, because if you address it, then you can overcome it and actually know for a fact. The next one is mind reading. We assume we know what other people are thinking. And it's usually, we do that thinking error when we think it's about us. So are they judging what I'm wearing? Oh, I bet you they hate this top I'm wearing. I bet you they think it's ridiculous. I bet you they're thinking about my hair, how they dislike my hair, or they think I'm really weird, or things like that. And we're basically attaching labels to ourselves, and they're all negative. But again, we don't know that for a fact. And even if they are judging you negatively, it doesn't matter, it doesn't really make that much difference. So that's, again, a really common thinking error, especially in teenage years, because it is important, the social circles, or rather they feel important at the time. So mind reading is common, but the best way is to reassure yourself that you don't actually know. And even if you did, there's nothing you can do about their opinion. It doesn't really matter. The next one is emotional reasoning, where we attach things to our emotions. Take, for example, you're experiencing high levels of anxiety and you just think everything is going terribly and it's a disaster and you're going to fail everything. So I'm thinking of, let's say, an exam, and you're anxious and you think there's no way I'm going to be able to stay, I'm not going to be able to do the paper, I'm going to fail this course, they're going to kick me out of school. Those types of reasoning, they're very common with people who struggle with anxiety and depression. So very similarly to everything else, don't try and reason when you're feeling really emotional or overwhelmed. It doesn't usually work. It's very hard to go back, so just wait until you calm down and look back on the situation. One good technique could be to have a little notebook dedicated to that, where you write down how you're interpreting a situation in the moment, and then a day or so later you go back and you write how you view it then. There's quite a good chance that the reasoning will be different. And that's fine, because again, it's all about recognizing those thinking errors so that you can slowly overcome them. It won't happen overnight because it's a habit. It takes time to break a habit and make a new one. But you start by recognizing. A very, very common thinking error for those with anxiety is predicting what's going to happen. And it's though you feel like you know that that is going to happen for sure. What I found tricky about that is that people with anxiety are very perceptive, and that can mean that they're right. And then it's very difficult to realize that that is a thinking error. So this is how I would overcome that one. Say, for example, you're thinking of going to a place, but you're like, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, it's going to be awful. Write down those predictions, and if you're feeling well enough, go to that event, see what happens, and then write down what happens. Then you'll get a very realistic record of how often your predictions are right. Another way you can overcome it is by facing that worst case. So what happens if the worst thing happens? At least you went and you tried. Ultimately, we don't know what the future holds. We don't know what's going to happen. So even if we are right with our theories, that doesn't mean we should not try things or go places just because we think it's going to end badly. Another thinking error is exaggeration. Again, I would say this is more common with anxiety rather than depression. My experience with depression is quite limited it's quite a short period of time in my life. But exaggeration it makes sense with anxiety because you're overwhelmed. It's a stress response. There is a danger, and your body is basically fighting for its survival, saying you're gonna die if you don't run away or if you don't fight it. But exaggeration then becomes a thinking habit with lower levels of anxiety, and then everything seems worse than it is. That again, mostly can be overcome with writing down the worst case scenario. And writing down the facts. With a lot of thinking errors, it really helps to write down the facts of situations, because then you can see where your thoughts are going and what's actually happening, or what actually happened. Comparison, again, is very common with thinking errors because it's human nature, and a lot of people embed that into us when we're younger. Oh, this person's better than that person. Oh, that person's the lowest in their class. This person's the most smart. This person's the most pretty. And then there are those competitions where it is about who is the best. That leads to comparisons on a daily basis. And that takes a really long time to get over, because you're basically rewiring human nature. It's normal to compare yourself, but actually normal doesn't mean it's what should be done. There are competitions, and in those competitions it should really be about doing your best. And in daily life, there's no need to compare. The moment you feel yourself comparing somebody else to you, or somebody else, some other person, write down 3 things that you like about yourself, or 3 things that you're good at. Redirect that comparison to just focusing on you for the moment. Don't worry about how pretty they are. Don't worry about how skillful they are. What are your skills? What are your strengths? And slowly, you'll again be rewiring your brain to find out what you like about yourself. You don't need to compare. We all have different abilities. It's a case of finding yours, and it doesn't really matter what somebody else's is, unless you are running a business or a team where you need to know people's strengths. But again, it's not a comparison, because you want to build a team of variety, diversity. You want different people with different skill sets. So comparison is really common, but remember to write down what you like about yourself. Another thing which is more similar to prediction and exaggerating is catastrophizing situations, where every situation you go in with a thought of the worst case will happen. That's quite common with anxiety, because every time you have an anxiety attack, it feels like the end of the world. I wouldn't have believed how bad anxiety attacks can get if I had not experienced them myself. Because you know it's completely psychological. Yes, it has physical symptoms, but nothing is happening to you. Like, you're not actually being tortured by anything. Yet, it is so overpowering that it's debilitating. It makes sense to want to avoid that at all costs. But that also can lead to the thinking error of just assuming the worst will always happen. That then leads to avoidance, which isn't really great. So if you find that worst case scenario keeps popping into your head, the 2 things I'd recommend, one is to really see the probability of that happening. Like, how many times have you done something similar, and how many times has the worst case happened? Second thing is to face that worst case scenario. If you overcome it once mentally, having to overcome it in reality is easier. Another very common thinking error with people with anxiety and depression is criticizing yourself a lot, thinking that you're rubbish, that you're good for nothing, you won't achieve anything. That can be overcome, again, with writing down 3 things that you like about yourself, a gratitude journal, keeping in mind what you've achieved. Goal setting can be good for this, because you'll have a record of all the goals you've achieved, and that's really motivational actually as a tool. I had one and I thought, I'm never going to complete these goals, but okay, I'll write them down anyway. And I think 2 years later, something like that, I'd forgotten about it and I found it, and I looked through and I was like, wow, I've achieved this, I've achieved this, and I couldn't believe it. you don't realize how much you're actually achieving or what your capabilities are until it's written down, really, or somebody else reminds you. So the best way to remind yourself is by writing it down. Another thinking error is black or white thinking, which basically means something is either entirely good or entirely bad. Kind of like fairies from Peter Pan. It's not true. Nothing is ever really entirely black or white. That's just a case of slowly looking for things that contradict that thinking. So if you think something is entirely bad, search for something that's good, because there will be something good in that. Same way, I mean, if you think everything's entirely good, you don't necessarily need to look for what's bad. I mean, it's helpful to not allow yourself to go into some kind of euphoria about it. So just be aware and remind yourself if you start to think, this thing is totally perfect. It's not, nothing's perfect. Perfection does not exist. Remind yourself of that, but be happy. Look for the good in every situation. A common thinking error that I think comes in teenage years and into like being a young adult is thinking that you should or you must do something. I struggled with this a lot, and actually anxiety was the reason I couldn't do many things I thought I should do. Anxiety can come from stress, feeling overwhelmed. If you put too much pressure on yourself about what you should do, what you must do, it can develop into an anxiety disorder and you can have a lot more issues about it. So the way to overcome that is really, the way I try to do it is thinking, okay, I have one goal a day of what I should do, but that's it. You actually realise there is nothing that you have to do. You are free to make choices all the time. You could say, yes, I have to go to work. Well, no, you don't have to. I mean, you might lose your job if you don't, but then that's your choice nonetheless, okay? So just be aware that constantly you're making choices. Don't worry about all the unnecessary things that you think you should do, like, oh, I should be more creative, I should see people more. No, do what feels right for you in the moment. Be cautious of any consequences, but don't overthink things, because that's really common with anxiety, is to just think, well, all these bad things will happen if I don't do this series of things. But actually, that's not necessarily true. And it just takes time, really, because you get used to being told what to do as a child, so then as an adult you begin putting that pressure on yourself, and it can lead to anxiety disorders. Basically, that's it. I hope that you found this video informative, helpful, and let me know in the comments if you've resonated with any of these thinking errors, and see you next time.